Thank you, everyone, for tuning in at home. Today, I am joined by the wonderful Professor Annette Gordon-Reed for a talk titled Citizenship 1776 to 2026, approaching 250 years of the United States of America. And just a little bit about the professor. Professor Annette Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. So her CV is incredibly impressive, and we are so fortunate to be joined by you today.
I'm glad to be here. Glad to be
So
here.
happy to have you. So just for everyone at home, the way it's going to work, the professor is going to speak for about 40 minutes before we open the floor to Q&A. If at any point during her talk something comes to your mind and you'd like to ask the question, please submit it using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Not the chat feature, but the Q&A feature a little bit to the left. And we'll ask all of those questions, or as much as we can get to, in the last 20 minutes of the hour. So at this point, I'm going to disappear from your screen and turn it over to the professor, but I will be back later on to do the Q&A with you. So thanks, and I'll see you in like 40 minutes.
All right, great.
Signing off.
Well, thank everybody for coming to this. I have to say, this is the first time I've done one of these. I've talked to people on Zoom as part of panels and as meetings, endless meetings, but this is the first sort of one-on-one talk that I've given. And I'd like to say that it's very, very different. The times are very different than the times when I agreed to do this talk. We've been discussing this for a couple of years now, and I was supposed to be doing this live down in Cambridge, and that would have been fun, but we decided to go ahead to try this virtually and to do it over the technology of the moment, that is to say, Zoom. We are in very interesting times now, and as a scholar of the early American Republic, I always think about, and my colleagues always think about, moments like this, and you sort of go back to think of what the original intention was, what was decided, what was the idea about the creation of the United States of America. 1776, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of that, and there are going to be lots of celebrations, lots of discussions about it, and all of this is getting started now, and this new revival of 1776 that this is connected to in a way is a part of that countdown to the celebration. And in thinking about the talk today, what I would say today, given these particular times, I'm reminded of what a difficult question it was in 1776, the beginning of the United States, of what actually people intended to create in breaking away from Great Britain and going from being a subject of a king to citizens of a republic. And the first question that comes to mind naturally today, given what we're going through and what we've been going through for a long time, is what did it mean to be a citizen of the United States? Who was considered to be a part of the people who would make up the new republic? As I'm sure most of you know, when the country was founded, if we go back to 1776, it was a place where all 13 colonies had within their midst enslaved people, mostly in the South, but in all of the colonies. It was a place that was dealing with the question of Native Americans. I suppose New England, well, we know New England began that process in ways that people think of today when they think of the story of the Pilgrims, in many ways the apocryphal story of the beginning of Thanksgiving. But there were people living within the United States of America who were not considered to be citizens of the United States, of the new United States. And the question was, what would become of those particular people? Slavery was a fraught subject. We know that enslaved people could not have been thought of as citizens. They were not members of the polity and therefore were not part of the people. Native Americans were considered a separate, different groups, separate nations who were also not a part of the country. We've changed a lot since then. Things have gotten better in some ways. There are still problems, obviously, that we're dealing with. But there was this notion at the beginning that this was a country that was made for the people who wrote the documents, the kinds of people who wrote the documents founding the United States, the kind of people who mobilized to create the United States. Now, there's the tricky part to this because African Americans and Native peoples were part of the mobilization of the patriots to become part of to create a United States. There were others who were on the other side. Blacks joined the Loyalists, joined the English in their fight against the colonists. But there were people on both sides who were involved in this question about what would be the future of North America. The founding document, one of the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, that talked about the fact or declared that all men were created equal, gave people ideas, gave African Americans, enslaved African Americans, ideas about, or actually reinforced what they already knew. They were human beings and deserved the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they confronted members of the founding generation about this. There were freedom suits filed. Some of the northern states decided to enact gradual emancipation statutes, usually very, very gradual emancipation statutes. But this question about the place of these people who were not European, both Native people and African American peoples, was always in the back of people's minds. It was always a present question. Who are the people? And it's something that the person I write a great deal about, Jefferson, had something to say about, and others as well, who did not believe that the United States could be a multiracial society, the kind of society that we have, that we think we're working towards today, that we still have a lot of problems with. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But this question about how do you define the citizenry? How do you define citizenry and a community, a sense of community among people who were very, very different? You know, it's often said that the United States is not a country based upon blood, although there's some people who think it was, but a country based upon blood, but upon an idea. That if you believed in the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, or you supported the Constitution, you could be an American. And that's what it took. It was the idea and a spirit, a belief, not necessarily what your race, your putative race was that determined whether or not you were an American. Now, that is what is said, but we know from history that race and understandings about family and community always played a role. That is why there was no confidence or little confidence that there could be something called a multiracial society. How can you be a part of a community if the people in that community cannot become members of your family, cannot become one family, cannot become one in the way that you would like a community to be? Those ideas, that problem has beset America from the beginning up until this point. We know that there was a compromise with the Constitution on the question of slavery, that the document protected slavery in many, many ways. And as the concerns about slavery grew more and more strong in other parts of and particularly in the northern part of the United States, there was an attack on the institution from abolitionists who proclaimed that slavery was wrong, but not all of them really believed in this notion of community, that enslaved people could be free and that we could live together. In fact, some people, Black people too, thought that the answer to all of this was for Blacks to leave and to form their own community, that it's only by living with people who are like you that you can feel this sense of community, that you can have this sense of equal citizenship. And that was their basic thinking, but their first thought was to end slavery. We know what happened. There was a conflict that led to a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people and ended the institution of legalized slavery. What came after was still difficult for African Americans, but the notion of legalized slavery was destroyed in the Civil War. We know what happened after that. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson became president, a person who was ardently against the idea of one American community where people were considered to be equal, took Lincoln's place and tried to thwart as much as he could all of the actions that could have brought African American people into American citizenship. He himself was thwarted, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendments, were passed, and Blacks gained citizenship. Before, Blacks had lived in the South and other places as, well, the South in particular, as denizens rather than citizens, people who lived in a place but didn't have all of the rights of citizenship. The North had forms of state citizenship for African Americans, but it too was limited in many ways. They were treated as second-class citizens. But after the passage of the 14th Amendment, African Americans were given full citizenship, birthright citizenship in the United States of America. And with the 15th Amendment, given the right to vote, males given the right to vote, not females yet. So this was an advancement, sort of a movement from where we had started with 1776, opening the door for citizenship for Americans, the creation of citizenship, not subjecthood of a king, to the 14th Amendment that gave African Americans the right to citizenship. And as you know, that didn't solve the question. There was racial strife in the South and the North. Blacks were treated as second-class citizens. Even the vote that was guaranteed by the Constitution really wasn't guaranteed. Black people for a time had the right to vote and created statesmen, people who were legislators, one governor in Louisiana, but that was shut down with what they called redemption in the South. And this question of white supremacy, which was, as I'm sort of have not used that phrase, but was certainly a part of the understanding from the very, very beginning of the nation, took hold again in the South. Black voting was shut down, and Blacks continued to live under, or were made to live under, a system of Jim Crow, separate but equal, but was not equal, certainly. We have what is called the Second American Revolution in the 20th century, not just beginning in the 50s, that this was a long process that started in the 20s with challenges to segregation, challenges to keeping Black people out of various professions, starting in the 1920s, and a little even bit before that, if you take the Niagara movement, which began the formulation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The 20th century, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, was the 20th century. The problem was the problem of the color line. And Blacks mobilized to try to claim equal citizenship even more during this time period, which led to, as I said, the Second American Revolution that was fought, or was actually came to a head really in the 1950s with the Brown versus Board of Education decision that outlawed segregation in the nation's schools, and then eventually led to the dismantling of legalized Jim Crow in the country. So this effort at defining citizenship by inclusion has been a process that started from the very, very beginning. And it's an interesting way of thinking about all of this, because Malcolm X, sort of chiding civil rights movement leaders, once said, if you are a citizen of a country, why do you have to fight for your rights? You're either a citizen or you're not. And that's has been the conundrum from the very beginning. Are we a part of this? Are people who are non-white really a part of this, or are they not a part of this? Now, I have to keep in mind that there are other racial groups who have had to fight to be a part of this country. Immigrants who first came to the United States from Southern Europe were not seen as white in the way that we think of them as white today. And they had to fight to make their place in the society. The Irish, other people as well. But the interesting thing about this is that all of this took place, much of this took place within the confines of the sort of, well, not in the confines, but I guess within the four corners of the Declaration of Independence, so the words of the Declaration of Independence that founded the nation, that all men are created equal. Every group that has thought of itself as one, or actually wanted to become a part of the United States of America, have used those words to try to make a place for themselves in this country. And that certainly happened with the Second American Revolution, with the Civil Rights Movement. This notion of equality was seen as the touchstone of what it meant to be an American. And the question of how you achieve that has always been a problem, has always been fraught. Now, I'm often asked, why look back to the founding? What does the founding tell us about where we are today? Why should we care about that? And my answer is always is that we're such a young country that we don't have much else to go on. We don't have a national religion. We don't have, as I said before, we're not supposed to have a national race. The question of looking back to ideas and ideals, to me, seems a logical and a good place to start the conversation about what it is that what it means to be American today, and what in relationship to what it meant when we started. It wasn't a perfect world. It's not a perfect world now. But as I think of what is going on today with the issue of policing, certainly the pandemic that raged before and is still raging before the recent events of the past couple of days have given us a chance to think again about citizenship and think about the notion of the community. What responsibilities do we have to one another when a situation, a medical situation, is putting many of us or putting all of us in jeopardy? That doesn't mean that we go back to think of what would a particular individual member of the founding generation would think about this, but what does the understanding about creating a more perfect union, the understanding about equal protection, an understanding about safety and security, and the police power, how do we think about all of those things in relationship to the problems that we have to face today? There was, you could tell from the very, very beginning, in very polarized times, an attempt, I think, to make this first matter, the matter of the pandemic, a question about politics. Now, it struck me from the very, very beginning that a virus doesn't care whether you're a member of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It has a particular way of going through the world, through a host, moving from one to the next, and it has its own imperative. It's not about whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. But we've come to a time that is so partisan that it was made a partisan issue. I'm often asked, well, is this the most partisan time that we've ever lived? Certainly not. We actually went to war with one another. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, hoping that that's not something that will ever happen again. It's not the most partisan time that we've lived in, but it is an extremely partisan time. And it goes to the question of how people constitute themselves as political actors in a country. The founders didn't think or believed, many of them believed that you could not, or it was a bad thing to have partisanship. It was a bad thing to have factions. It's sort of hard to imagine how they thought we were actually going to operate without having parties. It was clear that they may have mobilized together as revolutionaries, but after the revolution was won, they developed different ideas about how the revolution, the aims of the revolution were going to be realized. And most famously, Alexander Hamilton had one idea, the people who became Federalists. George Washington, as the president, was much more nationalist than others. Other Virginians had one idea about how the nation should proceed. And Jefferson and Madison and others had a different idea about the way the country should proceed. So it's natural, I think, for people to divide up or to have different ideas about what is the best course of American action. That has happened from the very, very beginning. But it's moments when people forget the things that they have in common or think that the things that divide them are much more important than the things that unite them, that there is a fissure. And that's what happened with the Civil War, during the years of the Civil War, when they could not come to agreement about a system of labor, a system of government, what the Constitution had said about the relative positions of the people in the South and the North, and they broke apart. I hope, as I said, that we're not in that particular moment now, but it does seem to be a moment when we are fracturing over this question of citizenship, fracturing over this question of what the Constitution should mean, how people should conduct themselves under a system of laws that we look to try to provide stability in the world. Now, citizenship today should mean, it actually should always have meant, much more than just voting. It should mean understanding how the system of government works. It should mean taking care to understand the various roles of the president, the roles of Congress, and the roles of the judiciary. And when I say the roles, we should keep in mind that those roles have evolved over the years. Certainly, the Supreme Court has more power today, or is seen as having much more power than would have had in the time of the founding generation. But it's incumbent upon us, I think, to pay attention to all of those kinds of things. So when a person says that the president has particular powers to do one thing, you will be able to have a considered judgment about whether or not that makes sense. When Congress suggests that they don't have the power to do something or abdicates its responsibility to do something, you can think about whether or not that's right as well, whether they are in fact powerless to do things that the Constitution actually empowers them to do. The Supreme Court, you can look at that and question, their role. Are they to be partisan? I mean, obviously, at some level, any group of people who are appointed by a political party will have some degree of partisanship attached to it. Any institution will have some degree of partisanship attached to it. But you can think about the role that you want the judges to play and to be active as a citizen to make sure, or to try as hard as you can to ensure that all of the branches of the government adhere to their particular roles. We can think about the system of federalism that was put in place. When the 13 colonies came together, they were groups of people who thought of themselves as separate nations, as their countries. When Jefferson talked about Virginia, he talked about Virginia as his country. That's hard for us to think of. They would have said the United States are instead of the United States is, because they were separate entities. But when they came together in a union, to make a union, they also created a system of federalism that gave the federal government designated powers and state governments designated powers as well. And the thinking was that people in their states could do the work of citizenship. And when I say people, again, the caveat here always is that we're talking about a small group of people, a minority of people. If you think of, certainly numerically, women could not vote, and women were not participating in the same way in politics as men, and I'm talking about white women. And of course, enslaved people, the majority of whom were enslaved. Black people, the majority of whom were enslaved, were not participating in the same way. So when I talk about citizens, we're mainly in the Republic at the beginning, we're talking mainly about white males, but they were thinking about this idea that states were the best places for people who could exercise citizenship could do that because they were supposedly closer to the people. I often talk to my students now about whether or not that's true, how much allegiance they actually have to their state. Is the state something more than where you get your driver's license? where you live, but not necessarily know who the representatives are. Who, you may know who the governor is, but do you feel? You could ask yourself: do you feel necessarily closer to your state representatives and senators and officials than you do the federal government? Well, this notion of the state as being closer to people obviously came up in a time when when travel was more difficult, communication was more difficult. Now it's as easy for me to contact a federal official as it would be for me to contact a state official. I confess, I don't feel necessarily closer to state officials in New York than I do federal officials. And that may not be true for everybody, but I'm saying this to think about how the world has changed. When you think about a system of government that was put in place in the 18th century, that has many things that we admire, but also has some aspects to it that are built in, that were sort of a function of the way life existed at that particular time. In other words, how have things evolved over the years that should give us some different understanding about our relationship to the government? How do we think about federalism? How do we think about state action and so state officials versus federal officials and so forth? These are all the kinds of things that have made me wonder over the years, certainly in recent times, is it time to think perhaps about changing the Constitution in meaningful ways? A constitutional convention. Now, I give this to my students. I ask them about this, and most of them, I would say, 90% of them recoil at the idea. It's the last thing they think they want is a constitutional convention. And I always try to get a question. I ask them why. Why do they feel that way? What is so frightening about the prospect of having a constitutional convention where you go back and you sort of reiterate the things that we think are important, but change the things that we think need to be changed? And the predominant answer always is they don't really trust their fellow citizens, which comes back to what I was talking about at the very, very beginning, this notion of citizenship and its relationship to a community. I get the idea from talking to people that there is some reluctance and basically, as I said, they don't really trust. Many of them don't trust their fellow citizens enough to have a convention, to come together, to come up with a different way of viewing the structure of government, not viewing the structure of government, come up with a way of having a new structure of government. The United States sees the United States Constitution, almost as a sacred document in a way. It's the nearest thing to a secular sacred document if those two things don't go together, but something that we don't want to touch fundamentally. We've amended the Constitution, but this notion of going back and starting all over again is frightening to people. And I guess I can say that I understand the fears. I wonder what it would be like instead of a group of ideals or aspirations. This one person said to me, it would look like a statute book. There would be subchapter this, subchapter that, where people trying to put in place put everything in the document, and it would not have the feel of a document that put forth certain ideals that people were trying to aspire to, rather than direction, sort of complete and utter control over people's lives, which is what many of the people that I've talked to about this suggest would happen. We would make it a statute book and not the document that it is. But there were people, certainly at the time, who sort of assumed, obviously, in providing for the provision for amendment, the notion of a constitutional convention, of having had one. I wonder if they would have thought that we would have done something like this by now, that we would have, in fact, worked to sort of looked at where we are today, looked at the needs that we have today, and tried to adapt a constitution that would help citizens, that would be suitable for citizens of this particular moment. And again, I'm influenced by this, or not influenced is too strong a word to say, but I think about this in relationship to a very famous letter that Jefferson wrote to James Madison in 1789 when he was in France. And he talks about constitutions. And one of the things he says in it is that the earth belongs to the living. And he thought that each generation of people, each generation of citizens is what he's really talking about, are, bear a different relationship to the government than the one before. And that when that happens, when a new generation arises, that generation of people should be willing to get together and sit down and think about what it means to be a citizen. What are the things that they need to live the life of citizens to the fullest extent at this particular moment? Now, he thought that there should be a constitution rewritten every 19 years. Now, he picks 19 because that was some notion of a generation of people. I don't know that 19 makes a difference, but we can ask ourselves, and we can discuss this in the short time we have for questions, but what would be a reasonable time to say a constitution should be rewritten? The needs that we have now are not being met in the way that we think they should be met, and we should have the right to write our own ticket in a way, write our own constitution, and to decide how we want to live, on what documents we want to live under. Again, as I said, that's not a popular thing among my students, and I don't think it's something that's going to happen. And because it's something I don't think I'm going to happen, I may be throwing it out there, safe in the assurance that it's not going to happen, but it is something worth thinking about. It's pretty clear from the way things have gone down in the past couple of years. The past year, it just seems like a couple of years. It's only been a short amount of time, but this pandemic thing, all of this seems like it's been going on for a decade. But problems that have existed before this time, certainly the notion of the place of African Americans in this society, the place of immigrants in this society, are things that predate the current moment, the current crises. And it's worth thinking about whether or not we should have a real national conversation about it. I don't mean just a television show, but some way of seriously engaging with American law, the American Constitution, the American system of government as we have it. Because there's a sense that in some ways it is not living up to expectations, it is failing us. It could well be, and this is I could say, not a very pleasing thought to me, that the struggle over race and community and family, which is at the heart of all of this notion of citizenship, as I said before, people in a community who view each other with respect, people who feel that they can come together as one people, that this is just a hard thing to do with differences. The idea that ideals and concepts can hold people together, as opposed to relationships, as opposed to family, as opposed to community and the way we think of it, maybe it's too hard a thing to do. That the country is large and it's fractious, and the kind of ideal that I believe the founders were striving for, albeit in a system that left most power to one group of people. So it was easy for them to think that way. But what happens when women, Blacks, people of different sexual orientations, immigrants, all kinds of people begin to have their input into a system? It becomes much more difficult to manage, but it also means that because it means people have to work harder to try to find common cause. I think that can be done. I feel it's incumbent upon me to say that I think it can be done, but it hasn't been easy. And I don't have an answer to that except to recognize the problem, beginning to recognize the problem, that from the very beginning, this notion of who are the people, who belongs in America, all those kinds of things have been, for some people, contentious. African Americans have always thought we belonged here. James Baldwin said, in one of his many thoughtful and insightful comments, is that, if the American Negro is not an American, then no one is an American. And I think I adhere to that belief. I'm not one who thinks we should give up on the country, because this is something that we have helped to build. It's a country that we have fought for, and it's a country that we care enough about to criticize. And that's anything that you love, you have to be willing to recognize its flaws. You have to be willing to criticize with the hope that there can be correction. Black people, African American people, Native American people, immigrants, the people who come to this country believing in the ideals of the country, I think are in fact Americans. The challenge to that idea, which I think is implicit in a lot of what is going on today, is what's holding us back, and is us holding us back unnecessarily. I thought that because we had spent so many years as a diverse country, not always doing that the best way, that the country could be, I should say, a leader to the world. In a world of globalization with people moving around, we could look to our experience and say, it's been tough, but here are some of the ways that we might be able to start on the road to reconciliation, on the road to feeling that we're all one community. What's happening today doesn't give me hope or makes me less hopeful on that front. I try to be an optimistic person. I try to be realistic about all of this, and certainly studying the history of this country from the very beginning is reason to be realistic, to have a realistic view about the limits of all of this. But you have to try. I mean, I don't see what alternative we have that doesn't lead to more chaos, to more hatred, to letting other countries or the places that figure this out before we do get the jump on all of us and move ahead. I believe that we could be leaders on this front if we acknowledge the truth of our past, if we understand that there have always been questions among some people, a large number of people, about the citizenship rights of African Americans because of how we came to this country as enslaved people, despite what we've done since then. But if we're able to move beyond that, I think this country could be the beacon to the world that we like to say that we are, but the beacon in a good way, not an example of strife, not an example of exclusion, not an example of disarray and hatred. So with that, I would like to take your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I'll pop back up for this portion. And thank you so much, Professor. That was incredible. We have a bunch of folks in the Q&A who were just commenting that it must be challenging to talk so eloquently to a computer screen, and yet they found it incredibly engaging. And I want to echo that comment. That was really wonderful. And I'm so happy that you took the time to speak with us today.
I'm glad to be here.
Good. So
it's unusual, I will admit.
It's a little unusual, but we're making it happen. I'm incredibly impressed. I don't think I could have done that for 40 minutes. The Q&A is really engaged right now. I'm super excited to say that. I'm going to open up with a question that actually I'm seeing in a few different questions. So just to address that off the top. Mm-hmm. In the year 1776, approximately what percentage of people were considered non-citizens or not able to vote?
Well, what percentage of people precisely? In obviously, African-American people are out of it. The majority of people could not vote. Certainly women, all right, you got to cut out half the population. Women were not able to vote, and they were able to vote relatively briefly in New Jersey. So you got to get half of those people. then you get African Americans who are a minority of the population. But I could say, I don't have a precise figure of how many people total in the country could not vote. The majority of, in short order, white males, certainly by the age of Jackson, by the time of Andrew Jackson, were able to vote, the majority of them. But women were out of the picture. African Americans, enslaved people were out of the picture. Even in states where blacks were free, were sort of mixed on the question of citizenship, the right to vote. In fact, I would say that in the beginning, places where it was not specifically prohibited, blacks were theoretically able to vote. By the 1830s, by the time we get to Jackson, states are beginning to revoke black people's right to vote. And they do that in Pennsylvania, and, which had been considered sort of a beacon for black people. So the majority of people, if you think about women as part of the population, and African Americans could not.
Majority. That's very disheartening.
Mm-hmm.
We have some, I think, educators in the Q&A right now, or some folks who are just discussing their background with classes, and someone saying, when I was in high school, the subject that is usually referred to now as social studies was called citizenship education.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that I think dovetails nicely into this, which is, can you comment on the loss of civic education for young children?
Well, I'm, a part of an organization called the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we actually have a project that's devoted to this notion, American democracy. And I think it's really important. I mean, when I was in high school, we had, gosh, I feel so old saying this. When I was in high school,
No, I do.
oh, you heard about? Okay. I think it's very important for people to know about the American system of government. As I said before, and I was talking about, what can the president do? What have been the theories about what a president can do? There's no one, obviously there's a debate about the powers of the presidency, something that's going on right now. It's always, what can Congress do? What can the courts do? I think it's important for people to bring that. I would think it'd be important to have that back in school to the extent that it's gone, because an informed citizenry, that was, I keep bringing this back to Jefferson, but that was one of the things that he wanted for a system of public education. The reason for it was to educate citizens so that they could participate in democracy. It's not a spectator sport. Civics, thinking about your civic duty, the concept of civic duty, I think should definitely be something that is taught and people talk about, and with the hope that it would make more people willing to participate, not just in voting, but running for office, participating in local government, all those kinds of things. I think it's very important to bring it back. And there's a lot of moves to do that. Actually, a lot of people are interested in this because there's a feeling that people don't know.
I certainly feel like I could have benefited from a little more pointed civic education in my back when I was in high school as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have someone who's saying, in regards to the idea of not wanting a constitutional convention because people perhaps don't trust their fellow citizens and their decision-making processes, they're asking, if we had a constitutional convention now, do you see a place where that document could be any easier to amend than the difficult, cumbersome process for amending our current constitution without the need for a convention?
Well, I think that's the tough question. I think amending it, there would be a lot of amendments that would be required. I mean, I teach criminal procedure, and we talk a lot about the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure jurisprudence. And it's just clear that it has become sort of incoherent. What constitutes a search, what constitutes a seizure, all those kinds of things. Judges have interpreted things in ways that seem far afield of what the actual amendment says. So there would be there are just lots of things to deal with. I mean, we tend to think of the Constitution, and I sort of furthering this along by pointing out about the Fourth, but thinking about the structure of the Constitution, the other articles of the Constitution besides the Bill of Rights. What things are required of a president? Should there be more explicit statements about what are the duties of the president, the limits of the duties of the president. I think it would just be hard to sort of amend. By the time you get through amending all the things that people have identified, and I'm not just talking about me, that people have identified as potential areas of reform, it would be easier to just look at the whole thing rather than just sticking a bunch of amendments at the end.
Someone else is saying, I'm curious to hear more about how violence fits into this account of the founding generation and in the present. How might the Constitution and our history inform our view of violence right now?
Of violence?
Yes.
Well, certainly the policing of African American people is, I think, a legacy of slavery. The slave patrols, if you think about it, we really didn't have police forces in the way we think of police forces today, sort of extensive network of people, designed just to do that. This is the 19th century phenomenon. But you had slave patrols, citizens, white males in the South who were deputized, who it was their duty, it was part of their thinking about civic duty. And this is sort of the twin edge. Depends on what the civic, what civic duty means. The civic duty to patrol for enslaved people, African American people, who might be going from one plantation or some other place. Say, do you have a right to be where you are and show your past and so forth? I don't think there's any question that the idea of Blacks as presumptively fugitive, presumptively people who can be policed, has carried over to this time period. And that's a question of slavery, but it's a question of race. And back again to this question of community. Do people who are policing communities feel that those people are like themselves? Are they human like themselves? Do they have the right to freedom just like themselves? And that's been a fraught question from the very beginning. So I do think history colors this. History helps shape these attitudes, even though people probably don't think of it in that way. But history makes the culture, and it's a culture that tells you that Black people are suspect. And they were suspect even when they were enslaved. You can't put it off to, well, it's crime, and statistics show that, Blacks may create more of certain types of crimes. This has existed before any kind of keeping of statistics. This notion of Blacks as presumptively people who should be policed has been here from the very beginning of the country.
That phrase, history makes the culture, I feel like it just stuck with me in a really deep way. Wow. I have to take that all in. We have an incredible number of really excellent questions. As I keep saying, thank you all for submitting these. These are so thoughtful, and I'm happy to be able to engage with them. Here's a great one. You often hear that voting is a civic duty, responsibility of citizenship. But what are some other responsibilities of citizenship as defined by the Constitution?
Well, as defined by the Constitution, some other notions of citizenship that grow out of the writing of the Constitution would be to pay attention to to political acts, pay attention to the way the system of government is proceeding. It isn't just about voting; it's about participating in that. There's no requirement for people to vote, but the thinking is, and thinking around all of this, is that people would do that. That's what the ratification of the Constitution was about. It wasn't just the Constitution that was written and put out there. It was put to the people. And with the thinking that they were supposed to be involved in this particular process. And so from the activities around the Constitution, the activities that were taken, the actions that were taken at the time, the expectation was that people would participate. Now, as I said, this was put forth in a time when white males were essentially the people who were going to be doing this. And there's no question that the extension of the polity, the expansion of the polity, has upset many people. It did upset many people. The participation of women, the participation of of Black people, it's, it's made the whole more situation much more contentious in some ways. But the idea that in a republic, that if the people are supposed to rule, if we're supposed to be the sovereign, the government is not some entity that just got dropped here from nowhere. I mean, the idea is that we voted for representatives who are there to, to carry out the business of the citizenry. So, the subjects of a king can just walk around and be subjects. There's not really that much for them to do. But if the people are supposed to be sovereign, the people have to participate in lots of different ways, not just voting, but running for office, taking care that laws are being executed, believing in the rule of law. I mean, being a good citizen, believing in the rule of law, taking other people's rights seriously, not only being zealously guarding your own, but understanding that you are in a community. It seems to me, again, there are different notions of citizenship, but for me, all of those things are part of being a participant in a citizenry.
All right, I'm scrolling through the questions, trying to make sure that I can answer as many as we can in the limited time we have left. But we have someone who's tuning in from Toronto, Canada today, which is incredible. And they say, thank you very much for this. I am a Black Canadian male. Do you think it is important for other nations to take a study and conversation into their history like this? In Canada, we don't have many acclaimed musicals telling the story of our history or constitution like 1776 or like Hamilton. We're next to you, and I think we could benefit from a conversation like this. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think I'm a historian. I say everybody should be in every nation. People should be involved in the story of their country, of how their country came to be what it is presently. We're not hostage to that, but it's a useful thing to know. And Canada. It's interesting he should say that, because Canada has such a history of, Canada was a place of refuge, right? I mean, that's the place that people from America, African Americans, enslaved African Americans ran to. I understand that it's much more complicated than that it's not, no place is a paradise. And Canada has its own issues about race, whether it's with Native people, Indigenous people, or African Americans. But of course, it is a very important thing for people to think about their country's history, and you can always benefit from that. You're not hostage to it, but it gives you it's like reading. It's almost like reading literature in a way. It's its own form of literature, good literature that speaks to the human condition and things that are recurring in the human condition. So the things that you think are just that are happening to us for the first time have happened in some other way at another time, something that's familiar. And so, yeah, long answer to that is yes, you should definitely delve into your history. And it is something I think it could be helpful.
And if there are no existing musicals, you can always write one yourself.
I know.
I don't have the talent for it, but I'm sure someone watching does.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to 1776.
As am I. I think I'm very much looking forward to the time when we're able to have it on our stage. So, someone else is saying, is it accurate to say broadly that this country was founded by wealthy people for wealthy people? And if that assumption is accurate, would you say that the system is doing exactly what it was created to do, which is ultimately to benefit the wealthy?
Well, I will say that it wasn't just wealthy people who founded the country. I mean, there were people who mobilized. I mean, it wasn't just Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton. Well, Hamilton was nobody. He was somebody. He was a soldier. But I mean, the formation of the country, they had a disproportionate influence on this. I mean, there are schools of thought. This is the thing about history. There's no one history. There are different schools of thought about this. And each generation, sometimes they overlap. The founding generation historians had a view about what they were doing. The progressive generation had a view about what they were doing. And the thinking that this was all about economics and all about rich people has been a part of the historiography. And that that went away. And then the consensus historians came along and said, no, that's not true. But now, and it's partly all of these people together have an answer to this. There's no question that rich people, powerful people had a disproportionate impact on creating the actual structure of the government. But there were soldiers, there were members, of the middling sort, people who became active in politics in states, in the federal government, who were part of this as well. So I wouldn't say that it was created only for wealthy people. But in every country, wealthy and powerful people exercise a disproportionate power in those kinds of situations. It's been a struggle to even things out a bit, but there were a lot of people. This is a long way of saying there were a lot of people involved in the creation of the United States of America, and wealthy people did have a disproportionate effect on that.
Thank you. I can't believe it. We're at 4:58 p.m. The hour flies by. Every time before I do one of these salons, I always say that it's going to fly by, and every time it does so even more than I'd ever anticipated. I'm going to end on what I think is a really interesting question, and it's almost like a thought opinion question for you.
Oh, great.
Just for fun.
Just for fun.
The power of social media today, for good or for bad, seems to be paramount in our culture. How can we ensure that it plays a positive role in enhancing the spirit of citizenship and community, as opposed to being an instrument of divisiveness?
Wow.
I know.
My gosh, if I had the answer to that, man, I could bobble it and sell it. I had such high hopes for the internet. When the internet came out, I thought, oh, wow, this is a place for everybody to get together and share ideas and so forth. And it has been that. I jumped right into all of that. I read blogs, I did all those kinds of things. I'm on Twitter and I tweet. I try to keep a feed that is not divisive. I don't do snark, and I really don't do politics. I've not done certainly not electoral politics on my page at all. I think you're going to have to accept the bitter with the sweet. It's like everything else in life. Everything else in life, there's a good part and there's a bad part. And what you have to do is to decide that you're going to be a good participant. You can't control other people. There's always the block function. There's always the unfollow function.
I like that.
And you wield that with relish. At first I was a little hesitant about that, but now I don't think anything at all about it, because it is a precious resource. And you have to decide, each individual person has to decide how he or she is going to use that resource. You can't get rid of the bad. There's nothing in life that doesn't have a good side and a bad side. Too much, too little, whatever. But it is something, but to know that it is something that can be used positively. People have gotten together, they help people on the internet, they politically mobilize. It may not be the political mobilization you want, but it's a coin that has two sides, and there's no way, I just don't think that there's any way around that.
Well, as someone who spends a not infrequent amount of time on your Twitter feed, I find it inspirational and positive, and it does bring a sense of community to a screen, which I always appreciate deeply.
Well, thank you.
We are at 5 o'clock, which means we are at time. I want to thank you again, Professor Gordon-Reed. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. This was, as people are saying in the chat and in the questions, massively inspirational, and what a moment to have. I'm so grateful to you.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in from home. We appreciate your support. We hope you're all healthy, safe, and well. Until next time, I'm Sarah Schofield-Manser. I'm signing off for the ART. Have a good night.